You're tuned in to the Stingbat Radio Network on FM 101.2 KRPG.
Welcome to Dungeon Master Diaries, a podcast about Shadow Dark and other role-playing games where two GMs talk about their recent experiences at the table and hopefully give you something useful that you can take to yours. On the show today, we discuss coming back from a long hiatus. Hello there, sages and adventurers. My name is Jody, and with me, as always, is my good friend and GM colleague, Matt.
How's it going, Jody? Good to be back.
Matt, today's episode focuses on returning to the table after a long break. Why don't you take us to the table?
Jody, I've been running an in-person Dolmenwood game for over a year now. And it should be mentioned here up at the top that you actually play in this game.
A myriad of characters I've hashed through.
Indeed. We mentioned this a couple of our former episodes, but it is a Dolmenwood game using the Shadow Dark core rules blended with some Dolmenwood content. The interesting part, or I guess the sort of the feature that is at the core of this discussion that is important here, is that almost everybody in the group has worked or currently works, and for the most part currently works, in public education. And therefore, scheduling during the summer is pretty tough. And even one of our players who doesn't work in public education anymore, his wife works in public education, so his summers are scheduled, wall to wall. This is something that I had to contend with, and despite the fact that we've been going for about 3.5 years.
That's crazy.
It is. And awesome. Our first two campaigns basically just went the length of the school year to allow for people to go do all their myriad wonderful things during the summer. Now, however, there's basically no signs of the group struggling to get games in or stay together, and we're not worried about folks drifting off into the ether and the thing that happens to so many D&D groups happening to this group. There's 6 committed players and one
crazy
and one committed GM. I'll use no other adjectives to describe myself. And so that's super awesome because we decided that we were going to play a campaign that didn't just last the 9-month period during the school year. Instead, it's going to extend beyond, and it's going to continue until it finds some resolution. This meant that we were going to play through the summer. And Jody, I saw it working out wonderfully.
I had high hopes.
We'd play every 2 weeks, and it'd be epic, and there'd be an uninterrupted 2 months of wonder. And it turns out that people schedule things over the summer, and so we ended up taking about a 2-month break from our game. Not a huge problem, because everybody's interested in coming back, but it does present an issue in terms of bringing everybody back and getting them back in the game. So when we returned to the table just last week, I had my recap ready to go, and I had a couple low-stakes vignettes to kick things off as we dove back in to our Dolmenwood game.
All right, so with that context set, let's gather around the fire and let's pull at this a little bit more, Matt. What were the issues? What were you worried about after having 2 months away? And I want to say, as a player in this game, I was really concerned, invested in how we were going to return, because we kind of left on like a cliffhanger, and we were coming back like very in media res, but that's also really tough with like 2 months as a gap. And
Indeed.
Also, I want to give you credit. We also kept playing. We just played other things. Just because this group,
right,
the summer off teachers were scattered to the 4 winds. But so take us a little deeper. Let's talk around gather around the fire and chat about what was your approach? What were you thinking?
Yeah, so Dolmenwood is filled with crazy proper nouns. I mean, that's the understatement of the year.
Yeah.
For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Dolmenwood setting, we will, of course, put a link to the forthcoming set of books and tons of goodies from a Kickstarter that is hopefully going to fulfill very soon and then be available to everybody who didn't back the Kickstarter. But if you crack any of the currently available materials, you will find just an inordinate number of proper nouns, wondrous secrets, vibrant details. I think I am not alone in finding it to be one of the richest settings that I have ever run or read. That does mean, though, that my players have pages and pages and pages of notes on just a wide variety of what could appear to anyone who wasn't playing in the game as utter and complete nonsense. And so that was my major concern, is that you have all these details, and like you said, I had the high hopes of playing this summer, so we scheduled a game, and it kind of felt like we were in a new arc. We played one session, and yeah, we ended like right in the middle of this very tense moment in the game of some role play. The party had gone off in 3 different areas, so we had 3 different scenes happening simultaneously, and then there was a moment that kind of happened that everything wrapped up, and everyone's excited to come back to the table, and then just by the sheer sort of volume of schedule nonsense that ensued, we just ended up not being able to schedule games for a couple months. So that was what I was contending with, Jody. I mean, that's like, I don't know if you've ever had a hiatus like this or a similar situation. You already kind of described what it was like for a player, but like, how did you feel when you came back to the table, and what were you expecting me to do? And then we can kind of talk about what I did, and then whether or not I met your expectations, because I think there are some things that I did rather poorly, but I'm interested in hearing your feedback. So,
man, expectation. That was a whole lot of questions. So first
I want detailed answers to all of them, please.
Okay. As I'm sure anybody listening does as well. First off, no. The first question you asked me was actually, have I done this before from a GM point of view? No. And this is a byproduct, maybe an oft overlooked byproduct of running an open world kind of hex crawl campaign that you're running us with that's the big umbrella format of style of game that you're running. We can go anywhere within this very large map, this crazy woods. Probably don't want to spend too long out in the crazy woods. Stick to the road. It's safer there, allegedly. But so no, I've never done that where it was we took a break from that sort of game and then came back. I am always paranoid about like we're never coming back to play again, because in the early 20s, that's how every game went. We played something for 3 games and then we didn't talk again for 2 months. Then we came back and played something new. So I had no experience with this. I also really kind of metered my expectations of what you would do, because you as a GM have found a home in Dolmenwood with your like GM voice that is so counter to my like style and vibe as a GM. I love it as a player, but if I tried to sit in your seat when you're GMing and run Dolmenwood, it would be an embarrassingly bad caricature because it's so far out of my style and comfort zone. Sure. So I genuinely kind of came back with a like, what's he going to do? And then as we were gathering around the table and I cracked open my notebook with my own version of notes and was like, oh yeah. And then we all started just enthusiastically going, oh yeah. Then I became very curious of like, how's Matt going to harness this? Oh, yeah. And then the Bregles at the Elder Leap of the Underschmegel of the Dinkus McGee and the Prigwort and the Ballywick Woodihoo and the...
Okay, so let's dive into what the heck I actually did. So first things first, my first realization was that I wanted to give, first of all, time for everyone to reconnect. And I think this is like super important. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but like coming back from a hiatus, I didn't want to force the game. Like I wanted as a GM to get started as soon as possible, but that was mostly because I had like 700 ideas. This is what happens when you're a GM. You sit down and you want to start as soon as possible. It's like when you're sitting waiting for a test in class.
Yep.
And you're like, just give me the test. I was just studying for this test 15 minutes ago before I walked in here. And the longer you take to pass it out, the more information is falling out of my skull.
Right. I can feel the cram falling out.
Exactly. So I wanted this thing as soon as possible to start, but I also realized that like that our group hadn't really seen each other in a long time and hadn't talked about their summer experiences and travels, and it's the beginning of a new school year, so there's lots of stuff happening outside in our personal lives, and so I gave the group a little time to breathe there, which I think has both positives and negatives that we can kind of get into if we want a little later. But when we actually started the game, what I had ready was about a page and a half. I wouldn't say it was a page and a half of wall of text, but I had typed up about a page and a half document of what I wanted to kind of cover, and I kind of scripted it as a recap. And my goal in this recap was to give a sense of accomplishment, right? Like, look at all the stuff you guys did before we took this break. I also planned a couple of short vignettes, one featuring a PC that both the characters and the players thought was dead, who we role-played, myself and that player, a very quick scene of him being brought back as a vampire. Very cool. And then we had another scene with a character that the characters think is dead, but the players know is not dead, right. Who's off in the Feywild having her own story. And those were just like little touchstones that I wanted to kind of hit. That scene went on a little longer than I wanted to, so we skipped my third vignette, which we're going to come back to next game. I think maybe we should do a show on vignettes, because I've been vignetting it up, and so we talked about them in a previous episode.
Right, the session 0 intro,
right?
Like that, I didn't do that, and I mean I did, but I didn't. And yeah, it's a real power tool, and I think weirdly works strangely well with Shadow Dark specifically.
Sure,
in a way that's surprising, because like there's nothing in the rulebook that says anything about it.
No,
but it somehow like really seamlessly drops in. Every time I've done it or you've done it, I felt like, oh, that just, those vignettes were great for setting the tone, because
right.
Dolmenwood's got a vibe.
It does have a very specific tone and a very specific vibe. That was my goal with those, was to reestablish some like just little itty bitty. It wasn't going to be hard for both those players to dive back into those characters or those scenes, because those scenes were actually going to be pretty simple. They were going to be pretty easy for them to jump back into, and they weren't going to be presented with questions or situations that required them to draw on like a depth of knowledge of the lore of the setting.
Right.
Then we went and we kind of got back into the scene that we left the previous session 2 months prior. And I made a decision here, and this is what I want to talk about, Jody. I made a decision here to specifically not set this scene up with a ton of, I guess, scaffolding, right? I didn't want to describe it in detail, because what I wanted was for this to be an opportunity for everyone to kind of have a conversation. I would give some loose structure, and then folks could go and look at their notes. I thought two things. Number one, this will be the last thing in their notes. It will be easy to find.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Number two, I figured we ended on a cliffhanger, and I wanted to emphasize the stuff that players thought was interesting enough to write down and go off of that. And then the final thing I'll say is we did have one of our players who is pretty integral to one of the scenes that was happening. Right. And in fact, probably the most tense and important scene was not able to be there at this session that we kind of reconvened at. So that was kind of a hard thing to deal with, but those were the challenges. I think the biggest, most important challenge is just the sheer volume of information. That to me was like the thing that was most prevalent.
And I thought you did a really good job fighting use the analogy of like the test in class, that both the students are like, give me the test, and the teacher is like, hey, I have these logistics things and I can feel the energy for my students. I know they want the test, but I also don't want to answer the same question 57 times about the test. And that like that energy level, there was a natural transition with our group, because our group is maybe because it's a lot of teachers, is a very note-taking heavy group. We have two people that I feel like when I watch them are like transcribing the session. It's amazing. And then there's myself and a couple others who take what I like to now think of as character-centric notes.
They're curated.
Yeah,
they're
like
curated.
This is the story according to me, not everything that's happened. And the group naturally kind of started pulling towards that of like, right. We were going to dive into our notes. And that's, to a degree, that's what I'm picking up that I hadn't really considered as a player in the moment of, on one hand, you had to like set the tone, as you said, or like the vibes as I kind of phrased it. But then we had to at some point transition to getting back into it. And then from that, like, what are your two primary objectives after a hiatus? You have to do both. You got to get that background information so we're up to speed, and then we got to transition to in. And I think you handled that really well, especially considering, for my stakes, that I was there supporting this absent player. Like, I literally, as the bard, I'm playing a bard who kind of helped smooth talk and got asked to like, hey, talk me into this kind of political scene. And I thought you did a great job of just going, you know what, let's just, pull back from all the story and the edifice, because in a weird way, that permission structure of like, we did all this work to set the vibe and the tone and get back into the imagination space. Okay, now players be players, pull back from the imagination space and make some informed decisions about how you want to proceed with the following and which thread do you want to grab onto. And I, in a million years, would have never thought that we followed the thread we followed. We ended up, just a little bit of more context from a player lens was these other two characters had just gone harmlessly to a fortune teller, and then that really spiraled out of control for them. And that became the focus of what to do. So I'm going to throw you a question back here of, there's a kind of closing a loop of player knowledge and then GM necessary control, right? The GM has to give some structure and guidance to the table. Otherwise, my kind of high level oversimplification is murder hobos come from unstructured games. That's where that comes from, is there isn't enough story and structure to give people something to do. So you get ridiculousness. There's also just ridiculous play. Like that's its own thing.
Sure. Yeah, that would be my only contention with that. But a
when
pithy
I was
statement, yes.
When I was 12, murder hoboism is a power fantasy thing. It's a different deal. But for us, there was that bringing those two things together of like, you need to, and I think you rightly did, like, let us grapple with the year of play that's in our head and we haven't talked about in 2 months as players, but at the same time, like, you've got to grab the reins.
It should be mentioned that almost all of us work like at the same school, and those of us who do teach, we all work in the same school district. So that is, just as kind of an aside, that is one of the challenges at our table, is making a space where we can find places to separate work and play and have this be kind of a third space.
When I was in my 20s, it wasn't that different, though. That the guys I gamed with, I also went out and partied with, and went to the lake with, and went out live in my early 20s, really fun part of that life. So when we sat down to game, there was always also that similar transition of like shared away from the table friendship experiences. So I think for any group that's getting together and you're friends away from your imagination space, that's just a reality, man. Like, you gotta be aware of that. And so, yeah, that bridging player knowledge, like, you did a good job of like, okay, we're not going to sit down and be like, go, let's do this. Like, we're going to fart around. But then I was surprised how much people just started talking about the game. And I don't know if that caught you off guard or not, of like, people like very quickly started being like, oh, but remember,
to answer your first question. Yeah. So the way that I processed this was I had my own sort of thought about how folks were going to come back to the game. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to give a permission structure for people to not have to remember every single little detail. So the recap I wrote up was very specifically meant to be broad, and it didn't mention almost any proper nouns. So what I did was I mentioned proper nouns where needed, and then I pointed to players whose characters did the thing that I was describing that happened. And for instance, you lost a character in a dungeon. So when I was describing that, like, there was this big moment in this dungeon, I said, and some people perished, and I kind of like pointed to you. And my goal was to trigger memories by pointing to players and by giving these little bursts of content and have that be the thing that sparked those conversations. To answer your question that you just asked me, I had no idea that everyone was just going to kind of like extemporaneously start talking about all these things that they remembered. And at one point I sort of quipped, like, I I have a whole, recap here.
You did it twice, and I laughed because both times everyone went like, that's great, Matt. And everyone just kept going.
Yeah.
I mean, like, the second time I did try and do the player like, hey, you guys, let's let Matt do his thing, I guess.
But what I was thinking was, I was like, okay, I had a moment of thinking, oh no, did I miss the mark? Like, did I misjudge where my players were going to be when they got back? Because I think for some groups, you're going to have some groups where people are going to throw up their hands and be like, I didn't take any notes. I have no idea what's going on. Mm-hmm. And I actually don't think that I gauged where this group was going to be correctly. I thought that there was going to be much more of an on-ramp necessary, whereas everyone was kind of willing to just go totally scattershot and do the like, the sort of, hey, remember that one thing that we did? Yeah, that was cool. And then, and then complete, like, no chronology, just like stuff that's happening. So from my point of view, that was great. I loved that. It did make me realize that, two things. First of all, that it was nice to see what people were highlighting, because I sort of used that in my mental Rolodex to like kind of file that away as like, oh, okay, so this is a touchstone that I should come back to. And this is something that maybe that I can grab onto during the session and reference, and I'm not going to have to be pulling everyone out of game to be like, okay, this is what, if you guys remember, you went here and you did this thing, and that's what I'm referencing here, or that's what this NPC is referencing, or whatever. So that was nice. It also created a situation where I lost control of the group. I guess I don't want to say that, but like I lost control of the table. And that can be a great place to be, but it can also, when you start to lose the table as a GM, I think there's a potential, even with good intentioned players, to potentially completely derail and get too far afield. And so, I was doing my minor little quips of like, I do have a recap here, but there was a kernel of truth there, obviously, that I was like, you guys keep doing this, and you're gonna get spun up into a point where you lose the thread, and I need to give you an overarching thread to kind of or
GM the game.
I need to run the game.
Yeah. No, and I think we landed at a accidentally really comfortable spot that everybody got to.
Okay.
Because from a player point of view, what was happening when we were going through our notes was each individual character and player of said character getting a chance to reconnect in their own way with the world. And I think that's really important after a long hiatus. And then you astutely, in your recap, were also prompting, but you were, to use a metaphor I think we use a lot that works, you were pointing the camera, hey, as you go back through those notes in that role, this is where the camera, like this beat was important. Make sure you run that in your head. Yeah, and I think you were right there. The last little thing I kind of want to talk to you about is what I find challenging as a GM is that story time with Matt, that you gave us our overview, and it was like, no, the GM's gonna hold court, and whatever your style of GMing is, you're gonna, either through the voices of NPCs or through a dramatic reading or just by saying, hey guys, these are the highlights, here's a bullet list, whatever you're doing as a GM to recap, you then have to transition to playing the game. And we talked a little bit about this, but I want you to talk about, how did you feel like that transition from historic thought space, right? Our historical fiction that is our game history, to transitioning to the now and rolling dice and living in the moment. I found that really interesting. I think I probably would have been uncomfortable as a GM, and I will tell you that if you're having any anxiety, I didn't feel uncomfortable as a player. It went really okay, but I was curious how you felt like that transition went. Also, you had your map out. You had you had a 3D map out for us with miniatures on it.
Okay, so this is I didn't know when we were going to get to this, but the scene that we were walking back into was very complicated, as I said previously. So what I did was, we use miniatures, Jody, a lot. I think in Dolmenwood it's sometimes hard because everything is so weird that there aren't miniatures for Breggles, really.
Right. They're goat people who are wearing nice clothes.
Yeah.
Are tough to find.
Right. A mossling. What is a mossling? And there are no miniatures. They are coming in the Dolmenwood miniature set, but there are only like one or two. That point aside, I built the entire space, which is a festival ground for all of you, so that you had a visual for where everyone was at this festival and where everyone was when we ended the scene. How did I process coming back into play? I realized very quickly that I misjudged and I actually probably misremembered the final moments of our last session. That I didn't take good enough notes, or I had highlighted in, like, this is what the danger of having 2 months. In my prep, I maybe like left some stuff on the cutting floor, and that was the stuff that I think maybe the players remembered, or certainly that you remembered, that I was less kind of tuned into in the moment. And so what I decided to do was basically scrap everything that I had thought about doing and do two things. First of all, I let you guys lead the show, because clearly there was enough information at the table that you guys could piece together this scene and you could come back to a point, which I already was going to have you do, but I realized I basically needed to do almost no hand holding once I prompted you with a handful of, like, this is what it looks like. This is where everyone was. You guys were having a conversation. You had just come out of this tent from a fortune teller, and another one of our characters was literally just dancing around with a sage stick, hitting people to see if they were fey, which is great.
As one does.
As one does in Dolmenwood.
It's literally what got said at the table when she recapped, which I was like, I love that.
So once we established where everyone was, and I just let the table go, and then there was one moment of friction, which was the realization that one of the scenes, which was this conversation with some nobles, was heavily based on one of our players who is not there, or his character, which is fine, but I didn't clock that soon enough and make a decision about how we were going to come back to accommodate that. And so what I did was I just pulled everybody out of game for a minute and basically said, okay, I can see that we need to get everybody back together as a party. So that's what we're going to do. I just made the decision to make time go faster, to fast forward, and I fast forwarded everybody into a party. Now, I think I have enough goodwill with this group that people trust me to make decisions that are going to be the best thing, both for the narrative, but also just for the fun of play. Because we could have ground through some scenes in there, but I think eventually everyone just realized, like, it'd be more fun if we all got back together and we went and did one thing together. And immediately after that, everyone went in different directions anyway, so it doesn't really matter.
But we all went in different directions from the same point.
Exactly. And so that was a big thing. And I think something that is important is I did not do enough work to figure out how to get 3 scenes up and running with the touchstones that were needed. That was where I thought I fell down, but I leaned on the players, and that's the beauty of, like, having a good group is in those moments you can kind of go like, oh crap, I don't really know what I'm doing here. They're talking about things that I was not necessarily prepped for, or that I just didn't remember. I'm just going to let them go. I'm going to see where this goes, and then I will provide some guardrails to make sure that we don't go down any places that are going to lead to unsatisfying gameplay moments.
I mean, it worked out. It was we were all in it at the end, and we got where we were supposed to get. But I realized I don't know if that's actually true. If we got where we were supposed to be, it felt like a reasonable place to be at the end of the session. Was your session prep outside of the because what we've been talking about is this coming back from a hiatus and bridging that gap.
Right.
But then you had to run a session.
Yeah.
Did you prep those separately, or was the session prep different because of coming back from the hiatus, outside of the knowing, hey, I've got this opening hour that's going to be coming back and it has some unique features that we've already talked about, but then the session that followed, you still had to prep that session. So was that the same, different, that session that followed point?
My prep for Dolmenwood, and to once again kind of reference some of Dolmenwood's best features, it's incredibly generative. Like there are tables and tables and tables and wonderful prompts and wonderful things to find. a lot of the stuff that I thought was going to happen didn't happen, which is both the most wonderful thing as a game master, and it's also just the most challenging. And so there were a couple of places where I had to either do some improv or draw on things that I knew to be true about the world. And this is where really living in a setting as a GM helps you, especially one that is generative. It's a hex crawl. It relies on improvisation in a way that most, kind of heroic fantasy 5e adjacent or 5e games don't, where I don't have any control over what you all get up to. And so my prep was similar to what I normally do, which is just familiarizing myself with the places that you are likely to go. In this case, the adventure and the various places within this adventure. But then when you asked questions that were outside the context of the adventure and frankly outside the context of the immediate lore of that particular hex that you were in, thinking specifically about witches. And I don't want to give out too many spoilers here, because if people are interested in playing this, then I'm not going to delve too deeply into this, but the witches play a very strange and weird role in Dolmenwood. And that's the direction our session went, was there was an interaction with a witch coven. And that came, to pull back the curtain a little bit, that came from a moment of improvisation and also from an item that I had kind of randomly rolled and decided was in this place. Mm-hmm. And those were the only two things that happened. Was there was an item that had a connection to the witches, and it ended up being that was the thing that the party interacted with. And so, I mean, the thing I love about Dolmenwood is it never lets you take a beat as a GM. Like you always have to be on, and the lore is so wide and fantastical that often, you're just like grasping at it and trying to remember. And
right.
That's my favorite part. So that is a long-winded answer, but that was my prep, was normal, but also immediately useless.
Well,
not useless, but also like, yeah.
It sounds like you cast your potentiality net a little wider. That like, hey,
you were looking for some good, solid advice in that answer, and I gave nothing.
Well, I'm just saying what I heard, my friend. It worked out. We got where we were supposed to be. Speaking of getting where we're supposed to be, let's hear from a sponsor and come back and see if Matt and I can distill anything from this comedic return.
Dungeon Master Diaries is brought to you by Hench Recruiter, the smartest way to fire. Finding good hirelings and retainers is hard these days. You never know who's going to show up, and more importantly, if they'll be sober. Well, Hench Recruiter allows you to confidently find torchbearers and trap finders from among thousands of competitive resumes. If you've been wondering whether you should be holding a torch or a shield lately, it's probably a sign you could use a little help on your next delve. When you sign up, Hench Recruiter will post signage around your town of choosing and interview candidates before they come to you. Don't just walk around the town square yelling at the top of your lungs or making your way to the market to pick up somebody's friend's husband's son's uncle's brother who apparently went into a dungeon one time 6 years ago. No. Use Hench Recruiter to find the best possible matches for you and your party. Exploring dungeons looking for treasure is only getting more complicated and more competitive. If you want the most valuable treasures, you need to be competitive in this new era of crawling. So use code DMD when you sign up and get 20% off your first town posting and interview process. Remember, finding good help is hard, but it's easier with Hench Recruiter, the smartest way to fire.
All right, folks, let's try and bring this topic into the light for a last little gather round. what were some takeaways from this discussion for Matt and I as GMs? Things we'll stash in our little bags of tricks going forward for the next time there's a long break between one session to the next, and then you're coming back and you want to get back into it successfully. So Matt, now that you've reflected on this, what stuck out to you?
Yeah, I think the first thing is time to gab. Groups are ephemeral. They are filled with humans, and I think figuring out what your group's kind of needs are is important. And one thing that my groups tend to need, especially this one that we were talking about today, is time to talk about what's happening in their lives away from the table. And sometimes that's work, sometimes that's vacations, whatever. And I think sometimes as a GM, it's hard to give up minutes, and sometimes it's a lot of minutes of your session. It's hard to give up time, but it's important to do. And if you hurry people into the session, then that can lead to more harm than good.
Yeah, those gabs are going to come out during the session instead, because they're going to happen. Something that came out in our conversation that jumped out to me was, and we actually talked about this on the day, which is funny, and it kind of like jumped out to me now, is fast forward if you can. If your structure of your session, now this session was particularly tough to come back to because we were in the middle of it. We were having a high stakes political conversation, which is weird. I'm laughing because that's not usually my jam. But if you could fast forward, you could jump ahead a year, you could jump ahead a week, you could jump ahead a day, you could smash cut to something new and say, here's what happened in those scenes. And there's two things there. One, you as the GM have regained the necessary storytelling control you need at the table. It's some level of guidance for your poor players as they flounder with this imagination space. So you've regained that. The other thing is it's dramatic. Like, it gets people's attention. Like, if you had come back and you're like, you find yourself surrounded in torchlight, blah, 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 I would have been like, excuse me? Where'd all the Breggles go? Like, what happened there? I'd want to know. So yeah, a fast forward can be a super powerful tool. If it's been a break, like, do the recap, but then and jump ahead. Like, I was like, man, that's a good one if you can do it.
Get to a place where you can start fresh.
Yeah.
My second and final conclusion is kind of an extension of the last thing we were talking about in our discussion segment, which is to be flexible and prep broadly. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't prep specific things, but I think when you're coming back from a hiatus, you're not going to know much about what players are going to want to do, especially if you're playing a game kind of in the Shadow Dark style that is generative, where you're rolling on encounter tables. You don't know where this story is going to go in a lot of ways. So come back, be flexible with the time at the table, and prep broadly. Know your setting, be able to improvise, and let the players push to the things that are going to bring them back into the narrative and the things that they're interested in pursuing, because that's going to get you really back into the game as quickly as possible.
And I'm just going to echo you with my last point of things I'm going to take away from this conversation. I'm going to echo you and old Mike Shea, Sly Flourish, Lazy GM Prep is, just player-centric. Start with your players. It's been a long break. Think about, as rightly you did, Matt, what are your players going to be remembering? What do you think sticks out to them? What are the scenes? So in that flexibility and that broad prep, look to go, hey, who are my players? Who are these characters to me as a GM? Because each GM has their own unique take on each character at the table that's separate from the player themselves. And that story is also a shared story. It's one of the fun things of being a player and a GM is that shared story, that I play my character and I get to make the decisions for them, but everybody else at the table has a story about my character, and the GM has a story about all of us. So as the GM, make sure your lens starts there, and then get to the old plot points. All right, folks, as the torchlight grows dim, we hope you're able to find something useful in this discussion today that you can use in your future games. If you have any questions or unique experiences from your table that you'd like us to discuss in a future episode, head over to the Dungeon Master Diaries thread on the Shadow Dark Discord channel. Look for links to any materials we referenced in this episode in that thread or in the show notes. And if you'd like to reach out to us directly, you can find Jody on the Shadow Dark Facebook page under the handle Pezman, and you can message Matt via Discord using the handle SCMatt. Until next time, later, nerds.
Dungeon Master Diaries is a production of the Stingbat Radio Network. It is produced by Jody Kropholler and edited by Matt Bruner. Our intro and outro music is composed by Christian Schuster. Dungeon Master Diaries is an independent production and is not affiliated with the Arcane Library, LLC. Shadow Dark RPG is a product of the Arcane Library. Copyright 2023.